Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers. With me as ever, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And we're delighted to welcome a very, very special guest, Lionel Shriver, brilliant author of Mania and so many other books. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I was hoping for an extra very.
Extra. I mean,
hold it out.
I want to lay it on as much as possible.
I've been listening to the Trump speech to Congress this morning, and therefore I think in superlatives.
Yeah. Tremendous. Well, that's one of the things we're definitely going to talk about today. So we'll talk a bit about Trump and his sort of New World disorder. We'll discuss Britain's two-tier justice system, Britain's mad asylum policies, and finally we'll finish with the sort of memory holding of lockdown 5 years on from the pandemic. So, Lionel, to kick us off, you watched Donald Trump's speech to Congress, a joint session of Congress. I believe it was the longest speech in many decades. What was Donald Trump trying to tell us about his regime? That, let's not forget, is only about 6 weeks old at this point. It feels like we've been here forever.
Well, there's been a lot of emphasis on how his approach is one of dominance. That was what David Brooks was hitting in this morning's New York Times. And I think that was the overarching message. There's a new sheriff in town, and he's going to keep you in your chairs for as long as he cares to. It reminds me a little bit of Hugo Chavez's really, really long television speeches that were notorious torture in Venezuela. It's a great illustration of the process is the punishment. The roaring, and cheering and clapping, USA, USA, that jingoistic, really embarrassing for Europeans and honorary Europeans. And then on the opposite side, this funereal, grim stillness, aside from, holding up these little lollipops saying false. It was just, there is the famous polarity of the American, both the government and people, for all to see. I think even during Biden, it wasn't that absolute when Biden addressed Congress.
And what have you made of the Trump administration so far? It is, worth recalling. It's only been a few weeks.
Yeah.
But it just feels so... It's been a long
6
few
weeks.
Have you been able to get out of your seat, as you were alluding to earlier?
It's been dead interesting. There's something every day. It's like being in summer camp. I think that I'm in a position any number of Americans share. I have never been comfortable with Trump, the character. I don't trust him. He's erratic. And I'm not going to go on and on by why I might be uncomfortable, because that's become so boring.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he is doing things that I want done. He is not necessarily doing them in the manner that I would like them done. So that, for example, if we're going to trim the federal workforce, which doesn't have as much effect on the budget as you'd think. I think they're only about 3% of the budget. If you're going to do that, then do it in a considered manner. I have a nephew who works for the Weather Service, and he's always wanted to work for the Weather Service. He's on the spectrum, but he's worked really hard, and he loves his job, and he's really good at it, and he's terrified of being sacked. And it would be tragic for him personally and not good for the country for him to lose his job. So I actually, that's useful to me politically to see a window on the other side. I love the fact, though, that Trump is trying to expunge diversity, equity, and inclusion from the federal government, and ideally from the private sector as well. It just means mostly racial preferences, right? Often it's about racial quotas, and I think that's a pernicious element that I would like to see go. I love the fact that he's announced that there are only two sexes, which 10 minutes ago was obvious to everyone, but isn't anymore. I like that he doesn't want men to participate in women's sports. I mean, there's a whole range of stuff. Oh, and most of all, because immigration is my pet subject, I love the fact that he's doing very, very public deportations. So that has sent out a signal which is having a big effect on the number of people chancing their arm to cross the border. Word's out, you're going to be sent back, and it's working. So he doesn't actually have to deport that many people, as long as there are pictures on the news of these military planes and people being marched up the stairs in handcuffs. I mean, you couldn't get better advertising for, this is a new era and you're not going to get away with it. So I am in a weird position, even emotionally watching that speech. I am for him in many ways, but he really makes me nervous. And the Ukraine thing makes me nervous.
I did want to come on to that. I mean, what have you made? That seems to be certainly from an international perspective where the pot has been stirred most severely. I mean, we saw, since we recorded this last episode, we saw Zelensky being humiliated in the Oval Office. We've seen, European leaders scramble to come up with a defense response, security guarantees for Ukraine. What in general is your thinking on this issue?
Well, I mean, Trump has a point. I wrote on this a couple of years ago that the shape of some kind of settlement was already coming into view, that the battle lines would be frozen. No one would acknowledge that it was formerly Russian territory that they had taken over, but at the same time, functionally, it would be Russian territory just as it is now. So that was probably always going to be the case. And so the big question are the so-called security guarantees and some more ancillary issues of, do we keep Russia's frozen assets and give them to Ukraine to rebuild? So that much needs resolving. But considering that this ultimate settlement was pretty obvious a long time ago, it is a horror. That many people have been killed in the 2 years since, and I don't like seeing Trump suck up to Putin. I don't think it's to our negotiating advantage. I think it gives Putin the idea that Trump is a sucker and that he can be manipulated, which may be true. But at the same time, I'm sympathetic with Trump's desire to bring the war to an end. I wish it weren't primarily because he wants credit for it.
Yeah. Looking out for that Nobel Peace Prize that I think will probably elude him given how much Europe hates him. But
well, the weird thing about the humiliation of Zelensky in the Oval Office is that it doesn't turn out to have really dire consequences. I mean, it looks as if Zelensky has already come back and said sorry, and all the European leaders scrambling to come up with more money for defense and a longer-term plan, ideally to integrate defense, which is a big issue. That's what Trump wants, and it's probably good. It's good for the United States to be let off the hook a little bit in terms of coming to Europe's defense, and the Europeans have been skating on dependency on the U.S., and he's right, and he made a big point of that in his first term.
Yeah, it has been striking as well, where if you take the Oval Office blow-up kind of on its own terms, that was an incredibly dispiriting spectacle.
It was a little frightening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was so unusual, and also definitely seemed to be a underlining of the fact that within Trump himself, certainly J.D. Vance, certainly a lot of elements of the Trump administration, I mean, they pretend to, they present themselves as being the mediator, wanting to be diplomatic. It's a bit hard to square when you're holding back making any criticisms of Vladimir Putin, meanwhile calling Zelensky a dictator.
Yeah.
There was an element of humiliation of dressing down, of taking a certain relish in that, whether or not it was the plan going into it. I think it was a message they wanted to send to a certain section
I don't
of their
think
base.
it was planned, but in a weird way, that's worse because it means it was intemperate and it was impulsive, and it was allowing something to happen that had international implications without any forethought, and just giving in to your worst, bullying instincts, and I think that was to me what was so forbidding about it, rather than some kind of premeditated mugging.
And it did show that there is this new dimension to the America-Ukraine relationship, to put it lightly, which is that there are a lot of people in the Trump administration who don't simply, I think, see Ukraine as not their problem, but also as kind of the villains of the piece to a certain extent. That being said, I think it is interesting, with almost a week of hindsight, how the fundamental facts of how this relationship is going to work going forward haven't really changed fundamentally. You've got an America that doesn't want to defend Ukraine. You've got a Europe that couldn't defend Ukraine even if it wanted to, and now and Ukraine being kind of stuck in the middle of this particular situation. One can hope that we're going to end up with are the kind of arrangements which would effectively fortify Ukraine to defend itself. I think a lot of the claims being made, not just of more formal American security guarantees, but even European presence, feels a little bit illusory, just because of the fact that Keir Starmer is very happy, along with Emmanuel Macron, to kind of vigorously gesture against the Russian aggressor, but provided that they're stood behind their 10-foot American friend while they're doing so. It's very clear that this peacekeeping presence, so-called, won't take place unless it's under the kind of umbrella of American security and defence and so on. And you can feel for the Ukrainians in that situation, absolutely, because not just over the course of this war, but in the decades leading up to it, they were dangled more protection than they were ever going to be given. There was a constant talk of NATO membership, and that held out as a likely possibility, even though that was something that was always likely to be blocked internally by other NATO members. And also, I think deep down, various American administrations wouldn't want to walk up to that particular point. And yet, it's now we're just having to reckon with it. And it's difficult to see where these things are going to go, because there is so many things which might happen. And things like temperament do matter when you're dealing with international affairs. These things aren't unimportant. But it's one of those things where I think Ukraine kind of finds itself in the position it's always been in, which is needing to defend itself with as much support and ammunition from the West as it's possible to gain, it seems like.
There's also a structural anomaly here, because Trump is coming in and is presenting himself as a neutral arbiter. That doesn't make any sense structurally. For the last 3 years, the United States has been piling weapons into Ukraine to shoot at Russians. So, and then we're going to turn around and say, we don't have any friends here.
This episode is sponsored by Surfshark. At Spiked, we believe that free speech always comes first. But what's the point if your internet is always locked down? Whether it's data tracking, censorship, or region-locked content, there are just far too many barriers right now to a truly free internet. That's why I use Surfshark VPN to keep my internet truly private, secure, and unrestricted. With Surfshark, my internet connection stays encrypted. It protects my personal information from hackers, advertisers, and even my internet provider. Normally, every time you connect to a public Wi-Fi in an airport, cafe, or train station, you run the risk of bad actors intercepting your traffic and stealing your sensitive data. That could be your social media passwords, email login credentials, or even your bank data. But when I use Surfshark while browsing on public networks, I know that my IP address stays hidden and my data is totally encrypted. But it's not just about security either. Surfshark allows me to bypass pesky geo-restrictions and access content from anywhere in the world, meaning I can watch my favourite TV shows on Netflix or Amazon that aren't normally available in the UK. There are few things more irritating than starting to watch a show only to have it disappear from your streaming service. But with Surfshark, you can watch whatever you want, wherever you are. If that sounds good, then you'll also love Surfshark Search. This is a super clean, private, ad-free browser. It lets you search without having your digital footprint tracked, and it just shows you the most relevant organic searches. So, take back control of your online experience today with Surfshark VPN. Try Surfshark and enjoy a 30-day money-back guarantee. Listeners can even get 4 extra months for free when you go to the link surfshark.com/spiked. Just go to surfshark.com/spiked or follow the link in the description to get 4 months of Surfshark for free. So news emerged last night that new guidance from the Sentencing Council, an unelected Quango, has suggested that if you are an ethnic minority, a religious minority, a cultural minority, or if you're transgender, then you should be guaranteed something called a pre-sentence report. And then that pretty much goes in front of a judge and makes it much more likely that if you've committed a serious crime, you won't receive any jail time. Tom, do you want to explain what this is, and then we'll get some...
No, absolutely. I think you described it very well there. I mean, what this is a really kind of unfiltered form of sort of woke racialism as applied to the law. I mean, it couldn't have been more crude if it was drawn up by Ibram X. Kendi. The sad fact is that kind of Kendiism has been kind of percolating around the British establishment for many years, and this is an example of that. What's really fascinating is that if you look at what the Sentencing Council have said, the statement they've put out, since there was a lot of backlash, understandable backlash about what is a very clear-cut case of two-tier justice, is that they've essentially admitted that the aim of this is to address disparities in the justice system. So because of the fact that ethnic minorities tend to get more prison sentences, this is a way of addressing that, which is a telling admission, certainly, but also I think reflects the Kendiist approach, which is always taken to any form of disparity now, which is on the one hand, if there is a disparity, it must be proof of racial discrimination.
Yeah.
And that secondly, the way to amend this disparity, the way to address it is a new form of discrimination, but with more positive anti-racist intent. I think the way in which Labour have been forced to very quickly distance themselves from that, the Justice Minister has had to make her displeasure with these new guidelines clear, even though that's not necessarily going to nix them. She's been forced to do so. But this has been the drift of how we've thought about these issues for a very long time. And it's one of those things.
I don't want to be included in that we.
And I think
British state has...
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And because I think there is a tendency actually to act as if we've just imported all these things kind of post-2020. This is a kind of post-BLM response. These sorts of approaches have been taken for a very long time. You see it in the Lamy review of racial disparities in the justice system a few years ago. And take something like sentencing, it's quite clear that a large part of the disparity, for instance, is the fact that ethnic minorities tend to plead not guilty at a higher rate than white Brits, for example, seemingly based in a distrust of the advice that they're getting from kind of state-appointed lawyers and so on. So rather than trying to address that particular thing, what you try and do is put your thumb on the scale at the other end of the process in order to superficially make things look better. But obviously the consequence of that is the corrosion of equality before the law and a really ugly row now about whether or not different ethnic minorities are going to get differential treatment as a consequence of these guidelines. So it's as I say, it's kind of this new racialism in its most crude form, but this has been a long time coming. It's not just a kind of post-2020, post-BLM surt of response.
Well, wokeism has thrown out equality before the law a long time ago. So, and the UK has embraced that inequality before the law with both arms. This whole business of hate speech and having protected characteristics. Protected characteristics mean different laws apply to you.
Yeah.
And it's an utter anathema to conventional common law. And I'm afraid a lot of this, of course, comes from the United States. I mean, in terms of the obsession with disparate impact. That's all over. That Biden administration was big on that. And that has spread. I mean, Canada has brought in different two-tier sentencing for different races. And I think the worst of it is in California. Surprise!
So sensible about everything.
Where they actually changed the law so that if you were from a minority and had been already sentenced, you could retroactively argue in court that you had been victimized by not just racism, specific racism in your case that you would have to prove, but systemic racism, which is like blaming the Easter Bunny or something. So and therefore you could get your sentence commuted or wiped out because of this terrible persecution. this way lies madness.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
I think it was only quite recently where the Home Office leaked. There was a leaked report saying that it was far right to suggest that there might be a two-tier policing system or two-tier justice system.
They're now having to pretend that they were always against it in the first place. So they've pivoted very clearly from it's a far right myth to this is terrible and we do not stand for it whatsoever. But they don't actually have, unless they want to change the law, they don't have much power to stop this. And that's also kind of their own doing as far as the Sentencing Council is very much a legacy of New Labour. It was set up in the sort of dying days of the Brown years, if I remember correctly. One of these various supposedly independent, which basically means unaccountable bodies, which have significant power and influence, but are not directly accountable to politicians, let alone to the public. And so if they do want to make this problem go away, they're going to have to pick a fight with the whole kind of quangocratic state, really, which is largely their own creation, which probably makes it unlikely they are going to be willing to pick that fight.
Definitely. Another major area that is completely unaccountable in a similar vein is the asylum system, of course. And there's been a string of absurdities that you've written about brilliantly, Lionel, recently. One came up today. It was in the Sun. An Albanian terrorist who killed a policeman. He cannot be deported. The Sun basically has had this legal battle to reveal his name, essentially, because so many of these cases are anonymous. But he can't be deported because he might upset or he might incur the wrath of other crime bosses in Albania if he were to find himself there. What do you make of these kinds of cases, and have we just completely lost control of?
I've concluded that the only solution is to eliminate the asylum system altogether. I mean, I realize there's an element of pie in the sky there, but I don't mind planting the idea in some politician's mind. Maybe eventually this stuff will get so insane, though it's hard to imagine it getting more so, that someone will move on this. I don't even think that withdrawing from the European Court of Human Rights is enough. You'd also have to get rid of the refugee convention.
Yeah.
And I think that if you're really going to start picking all this stuff out, there's still other treaties that you'd have to withdraw from. I question the entire system. I don't understand why, as a legacy of World War II, we necessarily, just because we feel badly that we weren't welcoming enough for Jewish refugees, especially before the war, why does that mean that every Western country has to allow that every single person from anywhere in the world who sets a toe in their territory has immediate access to, if nothing else, the entire justice system, which they do not pay for or contribute to. And here, that system has gone nuts in protecting the rights of the asylum seeker. One of the things that really knocks me back when I read these articles, the Sun loves them. Someone can't be deported because his kid doesn't like foreign chicken nuggets. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. As a fiction writer, it spares me a lot of bother. What really knocks me back is the number of appeals a lot of these people have. It is not unusual to read that somebody has been denied asylum 8 or 9 times in a row. Why is that possible? Why can't you just make a single decision and there is no appeal? I mean, we could at least start there.
Or one appeal or something like that.
Yeah, not even one appeal. Just forget it. And this is expensive. And on top of that, of course, we allow that if you have set a toe in the territory, then you also have access to welfare, and there is some obligation of the state to put you up. We have all these expensive hotels. The British people are enraged over this, and so are the Americans. This is where Trump really has his finger on the pulse. It's like, this is out of control. The biggest issue in the U.S. economically is asylum seekers' access to health care, right? Which costs a fortune in the United States. So I think it's out of control. We just take it as a given that most of these people are not actually persecuted. They're looking for, quote, a better life, which is a little advertisement. The title of my new book. It is about immigration, but that's not out yet. So, they're gaming the system. It is just understood. And I don't even think we're sufficiently incensed about that. And furthermore, we're dealing with a judiciary, especially in the UK, which is chronically left-wing and is always looking for an excuse to let people stay. The approval rate is something like 75%. That's absurd. There's no way that 3/4 of these people on boats, for example, are coming from France, terrifying France, are doing anything but trying to look for better economic opportunity.
To sort of dwell for a moment on some of those more absurd examples, partly because it's colourful, but also because I think it's instructive. I mean, the fact that we've got now in the form of this kind of Albanian cop-killing gangster now has a kind of right to a quiet life, apparently, as a consequence of that. We've had the
Is there such a thing?
Well, but it seems to have been invented as a
Right
consequence
to a
of
quiet life.
We've had the paedophile who's invoked his right to a family life in order to stay here, and of
Great
course,
family man.
the sex offender who needed because of his sexual proclivities, couldn't be deported to his native Afghanistan. You contrast that with the very lofty, abstract, worthy discussion of this issue, and it is comical. I mean, people invoking Winston Churchill. Incidentally, this is the only issue on which left liberals apparently love Winston Churchill, and saying that as one of the architects of the post-war refugee human rights framework, he would abhor his party nowadays because of them inveighing against this. Do these people genuinely think that right to a quiet life, that paedophile's right to a family life, or the Afghan sex offender to be protected from the consequences of him acting out his own proclivities, do they really think that that's what Winston Churchill or anyone else had in mind when they drew up this particular system? Obviously not. And also the point in which this has become a really fundamental democratic issue precisely because of the involvement of the judiciary and precisely because of these conventions which have taken on the status of holy writ, effectively. That it doesn't matter what the public think about it. It doesn't matter how many statements and schemes that the politicians cook up. It seems to be entirely impenetrable to democratic change unless you do something much more significant, unless you start to totally unpick this system. I think we are still waiting for a party that really has both the willingness and the plan to do so. But I think these stories are starting to cut through in a way that they weren't previously. And I think everyone recognises that this really can't go on for all the reasons that we talked about. It's absurd, it's unjust, and also it's become an affront to democracy, effectively. So surely someone will come along eventually and make a clear-cut case as to not only why we should leave, that's kind of obvious, these various institutions, but how we're actually going to do it and carve out something like a properly just system.
The other critical right that's often invoked is the right to avoid torture, which just basically gets translated into someone might beat you up because if they find out you have sex with children, that's what they consider to be torture under these kinds of laws. So it creates the effect where basically your committing of a heinous crime actually bolsters your claim for asylum because you might be mistreated in your home country should you ever be sent back.
That's assuming that you wouldn't be mistreated here for being a pedophile.
Exactly.
Right?
I'm not sure that it's, often is implied that in Afghanistan they don't take kindly to this kind of thing, as if we love, welcome pedos with open arms. So on Sunday, this is going to be the UK government's official COVID Day of Reflection, marking 5 years since the pandemic. Lionel, I think it's fair to say that one thing that won't be reflected on is the lockdown and the horrors of the COVID response. This is something that has, exercised you in particular, exercises all of us. But how do you think we've come to the place where we've memory hold probably one of the most significant events of our lifetime in recent history? It's played no role at all in public debate lately.
And it hasn't played a role in the consequences for politicians. I mean, you would think, given how ineffective lockdowns were and how destructive, how much evidence we've got that they didn't really accomplish anything epidemiologically. I love being able to say that.
One go as well. That's
Real
very impressive.
tongue twister.
It's a word you haven't used in a while, I'm sure.
Why we don't talk about it? I think it's a terrible memory, and that's interesting to me because if you'll recall, especially during the first one, the weather was really great, and everyone talked about what a wonderful time they were having.
Sourdough bread.
So why isn't this like, oh gosh, I remember that first lockdown, and why don't we reminisce about it? But we don't. Nobody wants to talk about it. I mean, I just walking around London this last week, I keep coming across these stickers like on the pavement. Please keep your distance. Yeah. And I just shudder. I shudder. And therefore, I don't think it's just me. I think that we all found it horrifying and just do this. It's just don't want to think about it. And I think that inclination is to be resisted because we handled COVID in the UK horribly, and we handled it horribly internationally. The entire phenomenon of lockdown should never have happened. We were copying communist China. We were defying all our pandemic plans, both in the US and the UK that I know of. It was a panicked, irrational, bureaucratic response without any scientific basis. And then we had subsequent, edicts that also didn't make any sense. All that absolute absurdity about whether a Scotch egg was a substantial meal, as if a substantial meal made any difference to whether or not you were going to get COVID. I mean, it was an insane time. And there's nothing to be proud of. And the only thing that we should be able to get out of it is to take a look at it and to say, how did we let this happen? Why didn't we subject this to critical debate? Why did we shut down even our own press, which we harnessed to shut everybody up? I mean, it is a shameful period of, if nothing else, British life. And as a matter of fact, I would have to say that the one thing that I'm probably proudest of in my nonfiction life is that I was one of the very first journalists to stick my neck out. It was the third week in March 2020. And I said, these lockdowns are a terrible idea. And this pandemic is not bad enough in terms of fatality rate to be doing something this drastic. And it's not likely to be effective. That's probably my greatest act of journalistic bravery, and I'll stick by it. But I subsequently had a lot of company, right? Toby Young, etc. I'm still reading the Daily Skeptic every morning. But it's important to face when you have made mistakes and to come to terms with them. And I'm a little worried that the UK is not going to contend with the error of its pandemic ways for a generation. And that's long enough for another disease to come along.
Oh, I really share your horror whenever you come across those stickers on the ground or those marks. It's like kind of happening across the kind of old symbols of the old regime or something. That chill goes through you. And I obviously completely agree on the point of the folly of lockdowns. Spike was similar in terms of very early on pointing out what a insane authoritarian experiment this was.
Before it happened.
No, exactly. I've got a lot of flack for that. Trying to control a virus via state authoritarianism always seems to be a bit of a non-starter. But I often say to people, like, even if ultimately you agreed with the policy or you enjoyed your first lockdown or whatever it might be, the way in which it happened, the way in which it was done should terrify you. I mean, the fact that Parliament basically lobotomised itself, basically declared itself to be non-essential and went home. Matt Hancock was essentially empowered to rule by decree during that period using the public health regulations. He was making and unmaking law at the strike of his pen when his hands weren't otherwise busy, as it later turned out. I mean, this is a fundamental affront to not just liberty but democracy.
Yeah.
The fact that happened unthinkingly, just because that's what other countries were doing, just because there was significant media hysteria, should chill anyone who cares the least bit about freedom and democracy. But again, it's something which, for the sake of memory holding the horrendous experience of lockdown and memory holding the fact that, Matt Hancock was ever a thing, you can understand why people do it, but it's really important politically and for society that we resist that temptation, as you say, Lon.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back at the same time next week. In the meantime, why not subscribe to Spike's YouTube channel and then click the bell so you're always alerted whenever there's some new content. Spiked is producing more videos than ever, from podcasts like this one to interviews to our series of polemics. You really, really don't want to miss out on it. Plus, to get your daily dose of Spiked, just go to spiked-online.com. That's our website at spiked-online.com.